September 1942. At a mess hall in Oklahoma, a staff sergeant tells a young private he can't have any more butter. The private, Jake McNeese, proceeds to beat the sergeant unconscious. This was the U.S. Army's introduction to one of the most insubordinate, unruly, and absolutely essential soldiers of the Second World War. Over the next 3 years, the Army would try everything to get rid of Jake McNeese. They'd bust him down in rank, threaten him with courts-martial, and try to send him to the stockade. But they could never get rid of him for one simple reason. They needed him. McNeese was a born leader, a demolition expert, and completely fearless. He and his men, a wild bunch of paratroopers who called themselves the Filthy 30, were the ones you called when a mission seemed impossible. This is the story of a man who broke every rule in the book, and in doing so, became a legend. Jake McNeese wasn't your typical hero. He was half Choctaw, raised during the Great Depression, and carried a deep distrust for authority. When he joined the paratroopers, it wasn't out of pure patriotism. It was because they paid $50 more a month, a small fortune at the time. He quickly found a home among the other misfits and troublemakers in the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. They were the ones who gambled, drank, and fought their way through training. But they were also the best. McNeese, with his natural charisma and knack for creative destruction, became their unofficial leader. They became the regimental demolition section, tasked with blowing up enemy infrastructure. Their reputation for never bathing or washing their uniforms before a mission earned them their famous nickname, the Filthy 13. Their first test was D-Day, the night before the invasion of Normandy. The Filthy 13 shaved their heads into mohawks and painted their faces with war paint, just like their Native American ancestors. Their mission was critical: jump behind enemy lines and destroy 2 bridges over the Douve River to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. They were scattered during the jump, with McNeese landing in a church graveyard, miles from his target. He rallied what few men he could find and pushed on. Through sheer grit and improvisation, they managed to fight their way to the bridges and rig them with explosives. Just as they were about to detonate, a message arrived. Allied armor was advancing faster than expected. They needed the bridges intact. McNeese and his men had to hold them against German. They did. And then, in one of the war's great ironies, they watched as Allied Air Force bombers, who hadn't gotten the updated orders, flew overhead and blew their hard-won bridges to smithereens. McNeese could only laugh. It was just another day in the Army. After Normandy came Operation Market Garden, the ambitious and ultimately disastrous airborne assault in Holland. The Filthy 13 were dropped near Eindhoven, tasked with securing more bridges. Once again, they accomplished their mission, but the overall operation failed, and the 101st Airborne suffered heavy casualties. McNeese lost half of his original squad. The survivors were exhausted, traumatized, and sent to a camp in France to rest and refit. For most soldiers, that would have been the end of their combat tour. But McNeese and his men weren't most soldiers. While others were getting passes to Paris, they volunteered to parachute back into Holland to help the Dutch resistance. It was an unsanctioned off-the-books mission, exactly the kind of chaos McNeese thrived on. He and his men spent weeks behind enemy lines, living off the land, disrupting German supply lines, and gathering intelligence. Then came the Ardennes. In December 1944, Hitler launched his last-ditch offensive through the Ardennes forest, catching the Allies completely by surprise. The 101st Airborne, still recovering in France, was rushed to the front with no winter gear, limited ammunition, and not enough food. They were trucked into the key crossroads town of Bastogne and told to hold it at all costs. The Germans surrounded them, and the Battle of the Bulge began. The situation was desperate. The weather was brutal, supplies were dwindling, and German artillery pounded the town relentlessly. The 101st was cut off and besieged, and it was here, in the frozen forests around Bastogne, that Jake McNeese and the remnants of the Filthy 13 would face their greatest challenge. General McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st, famously replied nuts to the German demand for surrender, but bravado alone couldn't win the battle. They were running critically low on everything, especially medical supplies and ammunition. The only hope was an aerial resupply, but the dense fog and low clouds made it impossible for cargo planes to find the American drop zones. The first few attempts were disastrous, with most of the precious supplies landing directly in German hands. The division was on the verge of collapse. The commanders needed a solution, and they needed it fast. They needed someone who knew demolition, who could think outside the box, and who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. They needed Jake McNeice. He was pulled from the front lines and given a new mission. He was to lead a team of pathfinders, men who would go out into the fog-shrouded fields and set up signaling devices to guide the C-47 transport planes. It was a suicide mission. The pathfinders would be completely exposed, using smoke and electronic beacons that would act as a giant bomb here sign for German artillery. McNeice didn't hesitate. He gathered his men and explained the plan. Using his expert knowledge of demolitions, he figured out how to rig colored smoke signals for maximum visibility in the fog. He and his team crawled out into no man's land, under constant fire, and set up their equipment. It was a terrifying gamble. For hours, they waited in the freezing cold as German shells rained down around them. Then, they heard it. The faint drone of engines. The C-47s were coming. McNeice and his team activated their signals. Through a small break in the clouds, the pilots saw the colored smoke and the blinking lights. They swooped in low, dropping parachute after parachute loaded with ammunition, food, and life-saving plasma. The drops were almost perfect, landing squarely within the American perimeter. The 101st was they had the means to continue the fight. McNeice's ingenuity and courage had turned the tide. His Pathfinder team guided in several more successful drops over the next few days, keeping the division alive until General Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines and relieved the siege. The defense of Bastogne became one of the most celebrated American victories of the war, a symbol of resilience and determination, and at the heart of it was a troublemaker the Army could never quite tame. After Bastogne, Jake McNeice would go on to make a fourth and final combat jump into Germany, near Hitler's Eagle's Nest. As the war drew to a close, he ended the war as a staff sergeant, the same rank he'd been busted from countless times. He never received a Medal of Honor or a Distinguished Service Cross. His heroism wasn't the kind they put on recruitment posters. It was messy, insubordinate, and absolutely vital. He was the man you called when the rules no longer applied and only survival mattered. After the war, he returned to Oklahoma, worked for the Postal Service, and lived a quiet life, rarely speaking of his exploits. His story, and that of the Filthy 13, was largely forgotten until historians began to piece together the incredible truth. Jake McNeice proved that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who refuse to follow orders. They are the rebels, the misfits, the ones who break every rule before saving the day. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more.